past few years, I've been going in, making regular visits to prison, playing music with convicts. I recently produced an album of inmates' music recorded entirely behind bars. And I'm talking to you today about how and why I did that, and about a few of the things I witnessed over the course of that process. When I first set up a music studio on Wolfe Island, I became immediately aware of the connections we all have to prisons in the Kingston area. Your neighbor works in one, this family's here because they have a loved one inside. This business or service attends to those newly released. Prisons are this all-permeating, yet largely invisible part of the culture here. I read a quote by Jean Vanier a few years ago that really spoke to me. I'm going to go to that right now. He was speaking at the Grand Theatre in Kingston, and he said, "Kingston, you have a problem. You don't know the way a great number of your society lives, and you don't know on what your economy functions. Those walls are to keep you out as much as to keep anybody in." I've been playing piano since I was 2 years old. I still remember the sensation of reaching up to the keyboard to imitate my sister Susie, who had already started lessons. And it wasn't long after that my musical education began. I grew up studying classical piano. I sang in choir. I lifted songs off the radio always. Our high school band stayed on the road for 10 years, and since that time, I've made my living performing, writing, producing, and arranging. And music is so woven into the fabric of my life that it's easy for me to take for granted. But making music in prison has changed that forever. Not only has it deepened the appreciation I have for the role music has played in my life, it's deepened my appreciation for what music is. It's also instilled in me the sense that human beings can change for the better against great odds, given the emotional platform and the patience that music provides. So, when I read this quote of Vanier's, it was like a heart calling. And the closure of the prison farms had brought about massive amount of outrage and protest in our area. And I remember playing on the lawn that day at Collins Bay while my friends, colleagues, and yes, a donkey were being arrested. And I was thinking what to do. I have a history of applying music to matters of social justice, but this situation felt unique because criminals sponsor little public sympathy. I didn't think that a benefit or cause project was going to be effective. I just wanted to get inside and do what I knew how to for an environment that I felt was under attack. The local prison chaplaincy made it possible for me to get into Pittsburgh Institution, which is just on the east side of town. And I'd never been in a federal institution before. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know how I'd be treated. I didn't know if anybody would show up, if anyone would care. And the first day I walked in, I was privately terrified. You surrender what they ask you to at the desk, and then they affix an alarm onto your belt. And I walked into the prison chapel, and there was a horseshoe of 16 convicts in chairs with one blank chair in the middle that was for me. I brought a guitar. So I started playing a song. After that, they asked me to play another. Then I asked them if they had anything they could play for me. And a bunch of the guys were in the prison choir. So they started with a hymn. And it was a hymn that I was very familiar with from my days at the choir school. And hearing that song, I knew so well from those lips in that place immediately eradicated the distance between us. And so I sat down at the organ and I accompanied them. And then we played 3 or 4 more. Then the guys started producing notebook after notebook, journals, writing poems that they wanted to set to a musical context. And what was supposed to be a 45-minute session turned into 2.5 hours, and only stopped because the men had to leave to be counted. And as I was leaving the chapel, a prison official said to me, "Well, that was a bunch of murderers and sex offenders. It went pretty well, I'd say." I said, "Absolutely." And he said to me, "Don't you want to know who's who?" And I responded, "Not unless they want to tell me. That's already been dealt with. That's why they're here. I'm interested in what else is possible. I'm just the guy with the mic figuring out what sounds good." So the next week, when I came back, not only had they learned my song Oblivion for the Kingston Community Songbook, which we began working on, but they'd written responsive lyrics to mine and arranged them all in counterpoint. And I could feel we were tapping a geyser. So after that first recording, I kept up regular visits. Every week I'd bring gear in and we'd set the chapel up as a recording studio. But we were limited for time between counts. So everybody had to participate in running cable, line checking, miking instruments, and the guys became quasi-engineers and they became really efficient at it. I also started bringing in other songwriters and friends to talk about their experiences and share music. And at first, I was very reticent to talk to incarcerated people about the outside world. But once I saw how deeply they engaged with everybody I brought in there, I realized this is a very important facet of what was happening. When Sarah Harmer came in, the guys were grilling her about all her fine work protecting the Niagara Escarpment. And I remember her saying, "How do you guys know about that?" One of the men responded this way. He said, "Everybody looks at us like we're caged animals. But really what it is we're just in one place. And you're all moving around. And if you bother to pay attention from this perspective, you start to recognize societal patterns." Another conversation that will be with me always was prompted by a parolee who requested a meeting upon his release. He wanted to make sure that I was going to keep playing music because he was recognizing the effect that it was having inside, particularly on one individual who he said before we started had not come out of his cell for over a year unless he was ordered, and they all thought he was done for. The individual in question became one of the most enthusiastic proponents of what became our program. He exposed himself to be a tremendously talented guitarist and mentored everyone else all the time. So the parolee continued, and he said, "You know, when I was trying to get that vocal, and you stopped me, and you said, stop forcing it to be what you think it's supposed to be, and allow it to be what it is, that's when I got the take. And I realized that's what I have to do with my whole life when I get out of here." And what I began to recognize was the music was affording the men a means of self-evaluation completely unmitigated by externalities. The basic artistic act of taking responsibility for the sounds they were making was the basic personal act of them taking responsibility for their lives. And it was a self-generating freedom. You could feel it. When we were listening down to final mixes one day in the chapel, one of the inmates turned to a musician that I brought in and said, "You know, it didn't sound this good when we started. The fact is, I never thought I could be part of anything that sounded close to this. And it makes me think about how much in my life I haven't bothered with merely because I didn't believe. It took so much patience. It was so excruciating. I didn't think it was going to happen. But you're listening to the fruits of that patience. And it's kind of mind-blowing. I realized that in a prison environment, everything bad can be rewarded. and everything good might be punished or easily taken away. Compound that with the intense amount of stigmatization surrounding incarceration, and it's highly likely that a prisoner will deepen their identity with criminality well inside. Emotionally, it's much easier to avoid a present tense that is so harsh and subscribe to a sort of game. The government's lying, the system's rigged. Your sentencing and your condition depends solely on your legal representation. Best to grab whatever power you can and manipulate it, and avoid feeling at all costs. Yet when the guys started to do something beautiful, it gave them stake in the present tense. And that carried so much joy, but it was also laden with intense pain. We all have our demons and discouragements. But what do you do with feeling when you've killed somebody? When our demons take the form of having caused harm to others, we avoid them at all costs. Yet when something happens that inspires you to be present, you don't have a choice. You either kill yourself or you adopt the immense amount of courage and humility necessary to take responsibility for who you are. And I believe that anybody who crosses that threshold is less likely to harm to another individual than most walking the streets today. Anyone with emotional objections to the humane treatment of prisoners, I would just say to consider that most inside will one day be out. And how do you want them socialized? Through hostility and isolation? Or through methods known to inspire personal growth with constant societal contact? How a prisoner is treated directly affects his mind state upon release, thereby directly impacting the safety of our streets. So the first fruits of our labor has been an album recorded entirely behind bars, which is given away for free with suggested donations to charities and victim support. Inmates' participation is 100% anonymous, so as the guys are growing as artists and individuals, their time is also being harnessed for societal good. And I see no reason why this couldn't be imitated across platforms of any discipline you could name. The wonderful thing about mentorship is it doesn't just occupy the mind during an activity, but by building a relationship to live up to. And for those whose family experience was hostile or non-existent, it can be the difference between the eradication or perpetuation of methods of self-destruction. On rare occasion, I have to face the question of why do we bother doing good for people who've done so much bad? Sometimes it's hard to get your mind around the fact that the tragic, narcissistic, often violent act that lands someone in prison is the very thing that makes them vulnerable to exploitation. The entire human is eclipsed by a single atrocious deed. And similarly, the entire capacities and potential of our society are eclipsed by anger, vengeance, and its political employment. Victimhood is not a healthy psychological space from which to make decisions for your own future, let alone your society's. We need policies that serve victims, not use them. A few months into the work, someone who was really key in me getting this whole thing going met me in the hall and said, "So what are you doing in here?" And I said, "Oh, that would take too long to answer. At least a TED Talk." And I said, "You?" They said, "I was the victim of violent crime, and I became deeply interested in restorative justice. I wanted my perpetrator to understand what they had done, and I wanted to lessen the likelihood that it would happen to anyone else. The piecing together of an individual's life shattered by violence involves piecing together of our society fractured by the act. As Vanier said, those walls are to keep us out as much as to keep anybody in. So when I was in Paris, I saw Da Vinci's portrait of St. Jerome. And I've always known Jerome to be the guy credited with translating the Bible from Aramaic to Latin. And apparently he sat in a cave for 2 years doing this. But Da Vinci focused on a really specific episode from the saint's life, when a mammoth lion appeared blocking the door of the cave, ferocious and angry. But Jerome doesn't look at the jaws. He looks at his leg, because he realizes that there's a thorn in the paw. And he pulls it out and he quiets the beast. So I brought this image back from the guys, and they adopted it as the album artwork because they felt that was the work they were doing to their hearts. As much as I've been reflecting on the benefits of the men taking responsibility for themselves, I've been reflecting on our society needing to take responsibility beyond the warehousing of human beings. Enlightenment has moved us from drawing and quartering to incarceration. And we keep moving on that path towards perfecting the methods of lessening violence in our society. And prison is ground zero with its outrageous levels of mental illness, addiction, illiteracy, and legacies of abuse. When we access the positive capacities of a human being, we restore a human being, and all of society benefits. I want to thank you for listening to my voice today, but what I really want is for you to listen to theirs.